So, welcome everyone. For those of you who are not familiar with what is happening here, this is a lecture which is organized as part of a series called Perspectives, an Introduction to the Arts and Social Sciences. And that's a lecture series that is organized by the foundation program of the Faculty of Design to help us all familiarize ourselves with pieces of art, with ideas in the social sciences. So this is the context in which we find ourselves here. And today's lecture has as a guest speaker Chayanika Shah, who is queer feminist activist and thinker who has worked on a number of issues such as, where do I start? Issues to do with the control of sexuality and reproduction, looking at caste, looking at the way in which spaces are gendered. So she's got a number of publications which have been collaborative work with other people, such as No Outlaws in the Gender Galaxy, which might be a familiar title. And we welcome her today for this particular talk. And I will request Abhinav to actually do the welcoming. And this is you. Okay?
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for calling me here to talk to you. I'm quite unused to speak from behind the thingamy, whatever it is called. Today I thought that I would speak of some of the work that I've been doing recently, work that is looking at campuses. But before I get into talking about campuses of higher education, I just wanted to tease out some of the threads in the title. That we are speaking of space, we are speaking of segregation and discrimination. And does that ring any bells in your heads? Does it sound obvious that spaces are segregated and they're segregated in ways that are discriminatory? So would you want to give me an example of this happening? I'm sorry, I don't know how to give a lecture that only goes from here to there. So I'm just going to keep drawing you in if I can. You're going to be these resistant students who will not answer. No? Anyone wants to say? What is it that comes to your mind when we talk of space, segregation, discrimination? The first thought that came, because you all nodded, yes, it makes sense. You want to say? Okay. Anything else? Which is gender-based segregation? Would you call it discrimination? So we shall go into that, yeah. That's gender-based discrimination for certain people, segregation for some people, maybe affirmative action for some people, so it's a complex story, and we shall go into it. Anything else that comes to mind? Temples. Okay. So religion and its demands to places of worship, sometimes kept exclusive even within the religious community. So certain temples not allowed to certain genders, certain temples not allowed to many castes, certain temples not allowed to some people in some periods of their monthly cycles, and so on and so forth. There are various ways in which discrimination is happening. Maybe that's not really an example of segregation. So you may have, it's not necessarily segregation, but it is definitely exclusion. Okay, that's a very good way of putting it, that you do have access to public spaces. A lot of times, access to public spaces is on the conditionality of segregation, right? So that's the second point that we will look at. The most basic one where I would like to begin is the issue of caste, where segregation is something that is inherent to the way in which caste functions. And since we live in these national boundaries and these regions where caste seems to live with us, that it's important to keep reminding ourselves in how many ways does caste exist amongst us. So if you look at the village communities, then you do have different castes living in different areas of the village. And that's very clearly marked even today. By name, by location, the histories of people not being able to walk from one caste location to another is not very old. It's present even today in many parts of the country, right? So that kind of segregation, which was completely that you could not enter the other place because you were not the caste that was supposed to enter into that place, is one of the segregations that we've talked about, also because it came with the notion of untouchability. So it's much more than just segregating. It is also that you cannot pollute my area, I cannot go to a place which is polluted, right? So this is one of the things, and that, for me, the question of segregation and untouchability and discrimination has been most talked about in the context of caste. So one of the starting points for my talk today is from Dr. Ambedkar, who urged on people that if this is the casteist nature of rural India, then way back, and remember, everything is in a space and time. So at the time that Dr. Ambedkar was speaking of this, which is 20s and 30s, he spoke of people leaving villages to come to urban locations so that they could be in places where untouchability would not be of the nature that it is in the rural India. There was a vision of modernism that he totally ascribed to, and he totally wrote about and thought more about, and is a big thinker on these lines. He insisted that you come to the cities because the cities, with their largeness, with the kinds of anonymities with which we could survive, with the kinds of occupations, the newer occupations that were coming in, with the coming in of industry, you would be able to get over the village-based segregations and the village-based discriminations. And so this was a call that he gave to people, along with the call to get educated, get organized, and agitate. He also gave the call, move from the regions that are actually segregated to come to places where there's possibility of moving beyond that. And the third call that he gave was of annihilating caste through intercaste marriages, right? So because he did not believe in the caste system and believed in the destruction of the caste system, that he spoke of taking actions which would help us move from situations where it was impossible to break the caste system to places where the possibilities were higher, right? The city's imaginations then are modern, and in the modern imagination of the city is of the industry, is of places where many people live together in ways that are different from how they live in the rural areas. But did cities really become like that? Did cities really become spaces that were equal, spaces that were not segregated, spaces that gave equal access to everybody? All of you are from Ahmedabad? Yes, no? How many are not from Ahmedabad? Oh, lovely. So we have experiences of many cities now here. And can people look back at their cities and think whether segregation happens in the city that they'll come from? Anyone wants to give one example of any city? Because otherwise I'd speak of my city. That's not nice. Some other city might be nice. I come from Bombay, so don't speak of Bombay. Speak of something else. Anyone? Or you could even speak of Ahmedabad, if that works. So your cities are not segregated? Yes, no? You could at least shake your head like this and like this. Okay, you can tell. Okay. Okay, so wonderful. That's how the biggest cosmopolitan city of this country is, is actually made up of many communities living side by side. And maybe every city is like that. And one of the things that we are told is that when people migrate, because people usually migrate to cities, when they migrate to cities, then they migrate as communities. They do not migrate as individuals. They come from a certain region in a certain collective, and then they occupy a certain kind of occupation. So somebody gets a job somewhere and draws other people to come to work in that same space. And then living, of course, as you rely on each other and you live together, that these pockets are made. But I'm not talking of how people make that happen. I'm going to speak of how planning makes that happen. And I think that that's where the stress of the talk is going to be. That when planning happens, does planning also happen with the norms of society, or planning happens with an understanding that some of these norms of society at least can break? Right? So we are doing planning in a society which is hierarchical. We are doing planning in a society which is class divided, religion divided, caste divided, region divided, gender divided, ability divided, many ways it is divided. So when we are talking of planning for a city, then what should be the measure with which we plan? What should be the norms with which we plan? Yeah? So this is the idea that I want to place, and I want to contest that planning can be. Planning should be, according to me, but I'm just being modest and saying planning can be against the norm. It's not very difficult to make it against the norm. If it is done against the norm, it may change something within society. But it's easiest for planning to be done according to the norm. It's easy to plan so that the norms are maintained. And when you, as students of architecture, design, whatever, as you start thinking of your professions, then this is the challenge before you. Whether you're going to do your work by incorporating what are the norms of society and living according to them, or are you going to find ways of breaking out of them and doing something different so that things shift? Yeah? So examples that I'm giving are just exemplary, just to speak of how can you look at existing planning and critique it, so that when we try and do something else, we are conscious of this critique and hence incorporate it in our work. Yeah? So the city of Bombay, as he rightly told, is also a very young city. I think that's also a nice thing about it. It's only 200 years old, roughly. And I don't know how many of you know about how Bombay was created. That Bombay is not actually a land that exists. Bombay is a land that is continuously being made. It is something that is constantly made, and I find it still very fascinating that the land on which I think I live was not there some years ago. That there was the sea and it has become the land. So this is the city began roughly in the 1850s, and I just showed So what he was mentioning, Mulund is somewhere in North Mumbai. What we have here, the island city, which means that it is really has the sea on both sides of it, which we normally forget that there is a sea on the right-hand side as well. We only remember the sea on the left, and if you can read, and there is Bandra, and this curvature at the bottom is the Queen's Necklace, that's the Marine Drive. If you've been to Bombay, then, and if you've seen Bollywood, then you know what these places are, right? Marine Drive was very, very popular in the 70s. In every film of the 70s, that is what was shown. In every film of the present times, the Bandra Sea Link is what is being shown, right? Which runs across this thing. Somewhere there, the sea link connects in that manner, right? So now, if films have moved from the southern tip of the Marine Drive towards Bandra, it also shows that the city has moved more and more. The city started from the south and has expanded northwards. It only can expand in one direction. It could have expanded otherwise, but it has chosen to expand in only one direction, and that's part of the planning story. That how did it go in this linear fashion? Whereas if you turn around from North Bombay to this side, there's a whole landmass on this side. So there were plans of Bombay which would have made it a city with a bay, right? So if you go to the right of this, then there is a landmass, and you could have used the sea in between these two landmasses and made the city like this. Instead, the city kept growing like this because of vested interests. And that is a well-documented story. You can read it somewhere. So this is the interesting. This is how the islands, so the blank parts are the islands, and all the shaded parts are lands that we arrogantly say have been reclaimed, but actually lands that have been confiscated from the sea. Yeah, so all these are made lands. Everything that is shaded has been made. And many parts you'll see, even now you constantly see land being made. And one of the stories of the growth of Bombay city has been of how the poor have made this land and have had to give up the land and move away. And this is a recurring story right from early 19th century or mid 19th century till today. That there are mangroves in which people start living. We as middle class continuously abuse them for not taking care of the natural environment and actually living in those areas. As they live there, they fill up the mangroves, they make a land, and soon enough you find either a riot or a fire or something else which chases that population from that area, or a forced demolition that chases the people from that area, and that land then becomes reclaimed for the middle class. That it is actually claimed by the different class people. This is a story that's ongoing. So right in the south is where the heart of Bombay is. South Bombay snobs are a different category of their own, but that's also where the colonial city began. That's also where the center of power was to begin with. And you have the area of the fort which had the walls on all sides, and then there were the natives living beyond it, and some sort of fire made the British colonialists think that they needed to plan, because the congestion with which people were living, the kinds of fires that happened, that they had to start thinking of how the city will develop in the future. So there's one catastrophe like that. As they move forward, further down, so somewhere here, this is the dock area. The one on the right side is where the dock is. Obviously, when you have the dock, a lot of cotton growing lands are around there. So cotton was what came from Britain. The much world has history because of which textile mills started in Bombay. And the first mill started in 1857. That started in Parel, which is now here in this map is in the center. In the first map, it's right below in South Bombay. Right? So the mills were there, closely connected to the ports, and that obviously worked for that thing. Parel became the place where the working class lived. And these are working class, meaning people who are actually working in the mills. So you had a different kind of housing for them. You had chawls, and I suppose everybody knows what chawls are. So you had these chawls of different kinds. You could have chawls which were really elementary, a 10 by 10 room, common toilet at the end of the chawl, and maybe 1-story chawl, 2-story chawls, 3-story chawls, but these were the kinds of dwellings that were made. And in these chawls, in these rooms, more than one person lived, more than one, so 8 to 10 people lived in one room, which eventually became families lived in these chawls. So that was the nature of housing. Around the turn of the century, around the beginning of the 20th century, again there was the big plague. So in the late end of the 19th century, there was the plague, which again forced people to think differently. Because the plague was because of the nature of the dwellings. Because the lack of infrastructure, the lack of planning, that plague had happened. And so came the City Improvement Trust. And it made the area in which I currently live, which is the Dadar, Matunga, Sayan, Vadala, that whole area is a planned suburb. And you can still come and marvel at that planned suburb, and I'm sure that many architecture students are taken to see how planning was done in those times. The roads are wide, they are well laid out, there are tree covers, there are kinds of housing that are across that whole space. It's very planned. But now when I look back and I see that area, so it began in the early 20th century, and I think the building I live in is also made around 1930. So it's about 80, 90 years old. These buildings were all supposed to be 3-storied high. They had different kinds of dwellings. So the ones that was more south had proper contained flats. The ones that you moved further north had some sort of chawls, which were not the chawls in Parel. They were bigger rooms, nicer buildings, bigger verandas in the front and so on and so forth, but common toilets. So those kinds of buildings. And then you went on this side. But then the names of the building, of the areas came up. So you had a Hindu colony, you had a Parsi colony, and then you had a Tamil colony. And after the Tamil colony, later, after 1947, came the refugee colony, right, which is the Sikhs and the Sindhis. And this is the end of the city at that point, so you have basically the refugees on that end. And this goes along one side. On the other side of the Tamil colony, you have the labor camp, which means all the labor that constructed and made that suburbia lived in that space. And next to that labor camp today is Dharavi, which is again familiar to everybody. So within Dharavi, there is no urban planning as of today. There's much planning and there's much segregation within Dharavi. But by the names of these places, it's obvious that it wasn't only planning for infrastructure, it was also planning in some senses to segregate. So when you had a Parsi and a Hindu staying side by side across the road, but in segregated colonies, and then you had the Tamil living somewhere else, and that Tamil, as you see, as you go along, you find the Tamil being taken over by the Gujaratis, the Jains, Kachis, because what is it that they share? The Tamils there were the Tamil Brahmins. The Tamils and the other South Indians in the labor camp were not the Brahmins. The Brahmins here and the Jains here shared food, which is vegetarian food, and so vegetarian area became the character of this place, which is around Matunga. Right? So you see how there is a planning of the city, which is done with certain understanding, and that planning also incorporates another sense of the city, that there will be certain kinds of people divided according to religion and region and their concepts of purity and pollution living together. So that's how the city was planned, and that's how it grew. And I think that today, when we speak of the development plan from Bombay, and we've been in many struggles around it, we have talked continuously that mixed housing is something that we are constantly talking about. And by mixed housing, we mean that houses of various sizes should coexist next to each other, even if it makes planning inconvenient. That is what is desired for social interaction. Of different sizes, that places, every area should be multiply used. It should not be only pure residential or pure commercial. That the mixed use of space actually allows for better interaction if you have the, so the planning has to be such that it integrates rather than it separates. And this has been one of the things, how much we manage to bring into the development plan and how we think about the city is one question that we need to talk about. So what I'm saying is that planning also segregates unless it is conscious of the fact that it is segregating. The segregation could be around caste lines. The segregation could be along class lines for sure. The segregation could be along various other lines as well. And so one has to be conscious that what seem to be norms of planning are actually norms of society, and we have to constantly question them. So one thought that I want to leave you with and move to the second concept. That the segregation which was mentioned earlier when we started of gender. There is an understanding that the private and the public are divided. And this itself can be contested, that there's no clear line between what is private and what is public. But there is an imagination that the private is the home and everything outside is the public, right? Who stays inside the home or whose domain is inside the home and whose domain is outside? Is it gender marked? Is it gender marked? The space inside the home and the space outside is gender marked. And if you look at what is written here, then clearly you can see which domain is of which gender. And we're talking right now of only two genders. We're talking right now of a society in which our imagination of gender is that there are only two genders, right? So within that imagination of gender, we have the private and the public. The private is which belongs, or which is inhabited by women, and public is what is inhabited by men. So men might inhabit, of course do inhabit the private, but women definitely do not inhabit the public. And these are certain kinds of women for sure. So women that come from upper class, upper caste, so-called Bhadralok families, they do not occupy the public. They are not allowed entry into the public. And this segregation is not seen as discrimination, it is seen as protection. It is seen as, if these women go out, then they will be violated, they will be harassed, they will be troubled, and so we have to keep these women safe. And you hear this often? You hear this all the time. Actually, in present times, we keep hearing this over and over again. That if you want to reduce violence on women, if you want to actually control the ways in which society attacks women, then one of the easiest ways that everybody suggests to us is that you go inside the house. However many times that people might have shown that the house is actually also inhabited by the people who inhabit the outside. The house is not inhabited by only the women. The house is inhabited by those same very men that are outside, who we are supposed to fear. They also inhabit the house. So the house is not safe really. But the language is that the house is safe. The language is that the outside is not safe. And the language is that if you want to access the outside, if you want to go for employment, if you want to walk on the streets, if you want to go to watch a film, if you want to go and study, if you want to go and do anything, then for your safety, you should do it in a protected environment. And we have asked. We have asked for women's schools. We've asked for women's universities. We've asked for women's seats. We've asked, and we do ask even today, for affirmative action for women so that they are able to get out from the private and come into the public. Right? So now, how does one deal with this? Is this discrimination or is it not? Is this segregation in which you actually say that for a woman to be able to come out and study, it is safer for her to stay in a women's hostel or to stay in a space, in a PG, where there are rules that are like the home, which means that you have to come back at a certain time, you have to obey certain, you know what I mean, right? All those rules, if you follow, if you want to get out, then we will replicate what the home meant. The home meant that you shall be controlled. What you wear will be controlled, how you talk will be controlled, how you go out will be controlled, where you go, when you go, who you go with, all of that shall be monitored, not because we are trying to control you, but because we want to protect you. That language all of us are familiar with? Has anyone here not heard this language? So, because it is in your interest. Because it is in your interest that we are doing this. And so, if you have to get out of the house, and these rules of the house we've all agreed upon, we've all accepted, we all live by them. So then when we get out of the house, those rules come with us. Yeah? The rules that you should not be out at any time in the night is a rule that every campus will put on you. Every working women's hostel will put on you. That you should not be wearing certain kinds of clothes is a rule that everyone will put on you. That you should not go out unescorted is a rule that will be put on you. And this is all about protected access. So now, what does one think about this? Is this segregation discrimination, or is this affirmative action? And to what extent is it affirmative action? When does it become discrimination? For women also. And then I come to the first point that was raised. That there is another story that is happening here. What are we being protected from? That at least somebody can answer. What are we being protected from? The sex worker is on the street. Nobody worries about her. The upper caste woman the woman who works in the fields, the woman who works on the streets is on the street. People are not worrying about her. The trans woman is on the street. She doesn't even have a home. People do not worry about her. Yeah? When caste violence happens, then certain castes don't worry about the women of the other caste. When religious violence happens, then certain religions or people from certain religions will not worry about the others, the women from the other religions. So how does this shift, and what is it that we are protecting when we speak of our women? When we speak of people like us, when we speak of our women, what is it that we are protecting? So all that we are protecting them from is there is a code. There is a code that reproductive sexuality is what these women have to be safeguarded around. That they should not actually go and have reproductive sex with anybody else is what we are protecting. Yeah? So when that is the code, it is already putting a value on sexuality. It is already telling us that certain kinds of sexual acts are actually the sexual acts. Everything else is foreplay, right? So everything else does not matter. All other kinds of sexualities do not matter. All other kinds of sexual acts do not matter. We're building a normative. In this segregation, we're building a normative of what is sexuality and what is sexual acts. That's the first point. The second is that when you have gender segregated spaces, right, then there is a lot of homosociality. It's accepted. Men can stay with men and women can stay with women, and that's nobody's concern. So you can be in social spaces with the same genders. You cannot even be in a heterosocial space, because every heterosocial space is seen as a heterosexual space. And the converse is also true, that every homosocial space is not seen as a sexual space. Yeah? So you are underlining what is this normative sexuality in the segregation. Correct? The second point is that now at least we have opened eyes to other genders. And I say this very, very self-reflectively, pointing fingers at myself also. That the hijra who stood on the roads every time, I did not even pause to think, what about her? I did not pause to think, who is she? I did not pause to think, what is her gender? I did not pause to think, what is her life? Right? So that's why I'm saying that now when the trans communities, and especially the Hijra communities, have organized and come together and started and asked for their rights, that we are all opening out in the last 3-4 years to an understanding that yes, there is the trans lives. There are trans lives out there who we did not bother about, who we saw all the time but did not recognize or did not give recognition to. Yeah? So then, when there are people of various genders, then how does the two work? How does the segregation based on two work? Remember that the more you segregate, the more you clarify that there are only two, the more there are codes for those two. There are codes for how you have to be a man, and there are codes for how you have to be a woman, and anybody who transgresses those codes is going to be punished. Yeah? So when we come to an understanding of gender and sexuality that moves beyond the binary and the heteronormative, as soon as we move beyond that, then we are again coming back to the question, then is segregation really affirmative for anybody, or is it actually discriminatory? And I'm not giving a clear answer, and I don't think anybody can give a clear answer to say that all gender affirmation and all gender segregation has to be done away with. That's not an answer that comes easy. But definitely I start thinking today as a queer feminist that maybe segregation is not the way to go. And then I connect it to other segregations of caste, of class, of religion, and I wonder if any segregation is the way to go. So if for the city we said that there should not be segregation, we should talk of mixed use of space, then that should apply everywhere. Yeah? So keep this thought in mind, and now we come to the final part, which is actually looking at campuses and seeing what they do. Seeing whether they, and why I talk of campuses, let me start with that. So educational campuses are unique kind of spaces, and especially residential educational campuses, because there are many cities in their own ways. You have many communities living there, especially the large campuses. I'm not talking of the smaller ones, where you have students living there, you have faculty living there, you have families of faculty living there, you have other staff living on campus, right? And so you have a huge area. And I must tell you that when I was looking up that Dadar, Matunga, Sayan area that was being settled, that was being planned, it was 440 acres. When I look at campus like IIT Bombay, it is roughly the same size. Yeah, so there is planning. There is planning in campuses because they're huge pieces of land. They're huge pieces of land in which people are being located. So there is planning. Second, there are various categories of people. And so far at least, when we look at public education funded by the government, it is the most mixed community that we see of students. It is also probably it's not enough mix, it's probably the most mixed community of faculty that we see. You still do not see enough faculty from other castes, you do not see faculty from other religions, but you do see a larger presence of difference in the faculty. But of course you see a lot of difference in the non-teaching staff. Who works in the office, who works in the kitchen, who is the gardener, who is the sanitation worker, who does the cleaning, this is very, very clear. Right? So you have a large variation there, slightly less variation in the faculty, and a better variation amongst the students thanks to affirmative action. Yeah? Thanks to the fact that we have reservation for caste and tribes that people come in. So this is a mixed living. This is, for the students, it's a temporary living. The students are also just young adults when they come to the university. it is, in my opinion, and having been in the university system for all my adult life, I think it is a space where we learn to become adults, right? So I feel it is the duty of the educationists in higher education institutions to actually teach people how to live in plural societies. I do not think that just teaching them their coursework is enough education. That it should be a duty to also teach how to live together, how to be together, and then the planning and architecture of our spaces really matters. Because in many ways, we may speak something in the classroom, but what happens outside tells us much more. Yeah? So this was the reason why we decided to look at architecture and planning of campuses. And I must give you a little hint. I studied in IIT Bombay. I was obviously a woman student who's still around 10% of the campus strength, or 12% today maybe. When we were there, we were around 7% women. In a campus that had about 2,500 students, there were 70 women. So obviously it was a skewed ratio, and that is where we lived. The campus was, and even after all my experiences there, I would say that it is the outside of the department where I learned the most. Where I learned the most of how to live with other people. And so then that stayed in my head, and something about that campus, which is not what I'm going to discuss today, something about that campus started off this process. So what I'm going to attempt today, and we've not shared this data because we are still trying to work through it or putting it together. This is just the first thing. So we looked at 5 campuses from different disciplines. We looked at IIM Ahmedabad. We looked at National Institute of Design, Ahmedabad, National Law School, Bangalore, TIS, Tata Institute of Social Sciences, Bombay, and IIT Bombay. Right? So there are 2 big campuses, 3 smaller campuses. The law, design, and social sciences are smaller campuses, but IIM and IIT are really huge campuses, and they're almost compulsory residence for students as well as for faculty. Yeah? So I'm going to look at IIM in greater detail, just because I have the pictures for IIM in greater detail. That does not mean that I leave the others off the hook. But so yeah. How many of you have seen the campus? Okay. I'm sure that in your stay here you will see it sometime as something that has to be seen as, because all students of architecture from across the country come to see the campus, I'm told. Right? So there are 2 bits to it. The left-hand side, that side is the older campus. This is the new campus. And I always smile and think that the old is so heritage and so planned that to have anything new, it had to be new land. Right? And I say this because IIT, on the other hand, has some planning, but there is so much open land in between that things have propped up all over the place in apparently haphazard manner, but retain the zoning of the campus. Yeah, that was not possible here, because every piece of land in this older campus has been decided what it is for, and it has stayed like that. And then it also is heritage, so it cannot be disturbed. Yeah? So that is the campus that we are going to look at more carefully, the older one. We can look at this, we've looked at the newer one as well, but I'm going to concentrate on the older one. Are the colors visible? So this is the kind of zoning that we tried to do as to which are the academic buildings, which are the buildings for students, which are the buildings for faculty, and which are the buildings for non-teaching staff. Now you have to tell me. Which is the color for the academic buildings? Lovely. And student housing? That comes from knowledge, that comes from imagination. So it is yellow and green. Yeah? And if it was the IIT campus, you would be right, because the major land in the IIT campus is given to the student housing. It doesn't happen here in the same manner. Green is, right? It's easy to see, it's easy to read just by looking at it. Why? One, we've colored it differently. Proportion, suppose those greens were interspersed. Would it be so easy to say? That's how segregation works in our minds. And that's how segregation is done. So what was the need? All these hostels are similar. There's no difference, right? IIM at least does not have restrictions on mobility across hostels. It believes that everybody should be interacting with everybody. It encourages it, in fact. So what was the reason to keep the women on one end? We don't know. But that's how it works. That's how our mind works. I don't think anybody's thoughtfully done it. But like we all recognize that that is obviously the women's housing, then that is the women's housing. The blue is faculty housing. And what is the purple? Yeah. Now this is very, very beautifully constructed, but this comes in different measures in different campuses. The academics, the students have to be around it. Here it is showing all students around the academic. Sometimes it's not so clear, and we'll show another example of that. The faculty is in the middle, and then there is the non-teaching support, non-teaching staff or support staff. In the new campus, almost similar, only faculty housing is not there. Because obviously there's lots of space for faculty housing there. That the number of students has obviously increased much more than the number of faculty. So it has expanded here for students. Student housing has expanded. There is a further color here. That is for married students. And you find there's one green there as well, between the blue and the violet. That was also married students housing. I don't think it's used like that today. The light orange is the mess. So they have a common dining area, which is accessed by all the students and everybody else maybe, but that's the common area. And there's also, to go from one campus to the other, and if you've seen this is a very main road, flowing road, how would they go? So there's a lovely underground path which takes you from one to the other. That campus is designed by another architect, this is designed by another architect, but the parallels are being maintained in some manner. Otherwise, it's not. So I'm leaving it at that. I'm going to look at two things. One, look at the students' housing carefully. Yeah? And second, look at the staff housing. So the faculty and the non-teaching staff, look at that housing and that divide carefully. But I want to tell that, there is this space between it, in this, because it's a huge campus, obviously a much smaller scale drawing, space between the student and the faculty housing is like a huge piece of land. And I think we have some images for it for you to get a sense of how much distance there is between it. The space between the teaching faculty and the non-teaching staff is also very clearly marked. Here it is marked by very nice lawns and very green and lush things. The only space which I think, and I might be wrong, is where the green student housing is. Next to that, that whole patch is like a jungle. Otherwise, every part here has very well manicured lawns, very well planned gardens, everything. And you've seen the Louis Kahn Plaza. If you see any images, you'll see what I mean. That everything is very well planned everywhere. One last thing I want to say is that this blue here seems to be a new occurrence in campuses. That since government funding is coming down, every campus is thinking of ways in which it can get income. Right? And this I'm noticing in all the campuses, that there is a plan to how to do short-term courses, how to do things for people who are not the students that we were meant for, but so that income can be generated for the campus to run. And so this is the Management Training Center, or what is it called? Yeah. Which has similar classrooms, which has housing, which has guest house, everything. That's a self-contained thing. As well as those married students' housing is used for some of the people who come to study here. Yeah? So that is the description of the campus. And now I go to the two housings. So this is how the student housing looks. One side of it, It has these many sides, some 4 sides. So each side of that student housing in the ground floor, it looks like this, normally. And sometimes it looks like this. What is it? So that's the women's hostel. The previous one is the women's hostel, which has screens outside on the ground floor. And they extend only around the women's hostels, so they don't even take it for courtesy's sake across all the hostels. It's only around whichever are the women's hostels you have the screens. And they're put because the women wanted it. They're not put because the management wanted it, right? The scale of that is something like this. So if that is the room, this is what it covers. And if you look at the previous picture, then actually, sorry. Okay, I will have another picture later maybe. But if you look at that, the window, it has a wooden door till this height, and then a glass door on top. So actually the height of the room is high, and after that this thing is high. That is the height of the room. After that is this wooden door, and then is this open window. So actually if somebody wants to peep in, they will have to climb onto that thing. And only then they can peep into your room. So the women said that there are some people peeping in. And that's why they felt unsafe and they wanted the screens to be put. And now who are those people who are peeping in is the interesting question, because this is the path. If you remember those green, then this is the path next to it, and this side is that jungle. So it is essentially not the boys. It is not the boys who are studying with them, because boys can come from anywhere. It is protection from the other men who are on campus. And the other men, unfortunately, for people entitled like me, are the men who come from the working class. Right? So those are the men that we want protection from, and those are the men for whom we have the screens. This is how I read it. And I feel slightly ashamed about it, because I feel that I should learn how to deal with it rather than blocking off access like this. That's my way of doing education. That I teach. I teach how to talk, how to address this question. Because you're going to face this question over and over all the time. When I live in my house in that safe suburban planned neighborhood, on the ground floor, I've had people peeping into my windows. I've had people climb onto my window and trying to see inside, and I deal with it. I don't block it off. I don't block it off by saying that I want to be protected. I deal with it, and I think that it can be taught. So that's my critique of succumbing to a demand like that as well. And giving up on a view like this. This is what you could have seen from your room. But you've given up on that because you did not want people to peep in. So that's your loss, right? So that's the gender housing, which is uniform and yet not uniform. Gender housing that is not different, actually. In many, many other places, and we shall see how the hostel itself gets constructed differently. The men's hostels are constructed differently, the women's hostels are constructed differently. So there are many stories, but this is not like that. This is a hostel which is similar. This is housing which is open to all mobility across hostels, and yet there is a problem. And now we're looking at the non-teaching staff. So we're looking at that area on the top. This is how it looks from the faculty side. Yeah? And it is strange because the windows here are so high. If you come in to the room from the other side, the entrance obviously is on the side away from the faculty. So the entrance is facing outwards. It's not facing inside the campus. If you enter from there into the room, you cannot see. The windows are very high. You cannot look out. So the window is there for ventilation, but the window is not for me to look out. So imagine a house in which I live, which is a 1 or a 1.5 room house, in which there is one door on this side, there's opening on this side, but on this side there is a window for ventilation, but I cannot see from there. And I wonder why. I wonder why this kind of blockage is necessary between housing on the same campus. Right? Whoever made this has to think about it. This is how it looks. So what I was saying, between the faculty housing and the non-teaching staff housing, there's this huge road. This is how it looks very beautiful from this side. For that side, how it feels, I do not know. And as soon as you enter from here, any of these paths to go to the other side, then you have different kinds of images. So you have this, you have this, you have this. That space is used in multiple ways. Yeah, so I'm leaving you with these thoughts. And if you see that whole non-teaching staff housing, it's very graded. So there's 1 room, 1.5 room tenements, a 1 BHK tenement, 2 BHK tenement, 3 BHK tenement. So as you go along, it keeps on changing. The character of the housing changes depending on the class of the employee. And that class of the employee is very caste determined, is what you have to remember. The faculty, on the other hand, whatever caste, class, region they come from, they have the same kind of housing. So which is a good thing, because usually otherwise the director has a special bungalow. And that's one star piece of architecture in every campus. The director's bungalow is one piece that is separate from the rest. Here we don't have that. If you go to IIT, you have faculty also living in grade 1, grade 2, grade 3, or A type, B type, C type quarter. But here we don't have that, but we have other kinds of distinctions, and that is what to be marked. And now this is National Law School, Bangalore. A very, very funny piece. I also feel sorry for these campuses as to what kind of pieces of lands that they get. They have got this one long piece of land, and now they cannot go anywhere else because the other side belongs to a university which has been built. So you can't do anything. The one across has also been built, so they can't do anything. So they are stuck in this little piece of land like Bombay City. They're just there, and they just go up, and that's how they can go. So that's National Law School, and we'll look at their design. So here, the pink here is the academic block, and it's very interesting because this campus has so little land in width that if you want to take a car from the pink area there to the yellow area here, you don't have a car road inside the campus. So instead you have 4 gates to this campus. And you get out of one gate, you drive, and then you get into the other gate. That's how you will reach, which is good, because they've not wasted any space inside for motorable roads. They've utilized every piece of land there, but that means that much more security, because security is very important. And every gate you have security, all the 4 gates, because all of them are accessible. One is accessible to the academic space. The blue at the end is the money earning activity. So that is the training whatever center, which has a separate gate. The 3rd gate is where the green is, and the 4th gate is near where the yellow is. So what is the green and what is the yellow? Same. So that's the women's hostel and that's the men's hostel. Right? So the academic block is there, that's the women's hostel, and then is the men's hostel. And I looked at it and I wondered and I thought this is wrong. Because what I'm looking at campuses, I felt that should be the men's hostel, this should be the women's hostel, because this is also the director's bungalow here, the blue one here is the director's bungalow, so this should have been the women's hostel. And there is a story. This was meant to be the women's hostel, it could not be, so it was taken back and that was made the women's hostel, but that is how it is. And I'm not giving details, but currently these 2 pink buildings in the center. The one that is all that star-shaped, that's the library. And that's the, the signature building of the campus. So if you Google National Law School, then you see the library building coming up. And usually all these buildings have these tall towers that stand, and that seems to be the main building, right? And there are many, many significances to that. But the law school has it. If you go to IIT Gandhinagar, you'll see one tower somewhere. If you go to IIT Bombay, then there's the main building, which is like a tall building that stands in the center, and so on and so forth. The academic building is not so tall, but they are building another academic building here. So they're going to again have the academic area, which is the classrooms and the library next to each other. Girls' hostel on one side, boys' hostel on the other side. And please notice the area on the left, the last piece of land that they've got, that is the sports facility. Yeah? Now, imagine what this means for living as men and women on this campus. And as this becomes the academic area, what will happen? So this is one, that's the women's hostel, that's the men's hostel. And there's one solitary men's hostel over there, because that's the undergraduate rule. The first year students have to be separated because of ragging. Yeah? So the first year students are kept over there. The rest of the boys stay here. Women don't rag, so women stay together. But the boys cannot go to the women's mess to eat. So each of those clusters have a mess in the center. So dining halls have to be separate. And that dining hall, so those boys have to walk every morning here for breakfast, go back, walk for lunch, go back, walk for tiffin, go back, walk for dinner, go back. That's how it is. But they cannot do the shorter walk to the other students' hostel and eat there. Because students are not students, they're boys and girls. And this is what it is becoming, right? The academics with the girls, the playing with the boys. Nice. Everybody's happy. Because finally women came here only to study. They didn't come to do anything else. Your access to public space is conditional. Please remember, if you stray from that path, you will be pinpointed. So men are not pinpointed and targeted in the same manner because they're supposed to grow in all which way. They're supposed to learn politics. Remember that earlier chart? They're supposed to learn politics. They're supposed to learn how to deal with power. They're supposed to learn how to make money. They're supposed to learn how to control everybody. Right? So they need to be in the world. You come, you go to your library, study, go to the classroom, take notes, give exams, go back, be good lawyers. And now I come finally to the TIS campus, which is again a very tiny campus. I will tell you why I'm showing it. So, this is a TIS campus. Again a weird piece of land. For a long time we had only the piece at the bottom, which is the old campus. And then this new land has been acquired, which is the new campus on top. Yeah? This is how it looks. Does it look different? Does it look a little at least mixed? Yeah, you cannot really say which is whose region. The staff housing is mixed with the student housing. One girls' hostel is there, one boys' hostel is somewhere else. The academic space is one place. But what I love about the building is that it is not the tall building in the center. It is a curved building. And the curved building forces the road to also be curved. If you notice this road, it just goes around. What it means for design is for you to say. What it means to me is that as the road turns, the institute changes. It does not keep the same character. It changes its character. That's how this built structure is giving me a sense of the space. What happens in the space, I'm not commenting on. Yeah, and how many ways does the present ways in which we control, how they affect this, even this architecture, is something that we can talk about. But because of this kind of thing, they still do not have inter-hostel mobility. They're still picky about girls not entering boys' hostels, boys not entering girls' hostels. But 2 days ago, they announced that there is a gender-neutral wing in the hostel. So I don't know what they're going to do after this, but yes. It is something that's come through the struggle of the queer students over there, that they've asked for a wing to not be marked as men or women. They're obviously thinking of a gender-neutral student housing, which is the vision towards which you move. They also are arguing for gender-neutral toilets, which did not happen, or which might happen at some point. But that's where the movement is. But currently, I'm just talking about how planning and architecture can change things. It can make you see it differently. Look at the new campus. Does it have the same sense? As a straight road that curves along, first you have the faculty, very small housing, then you have academic, and you have students. Clearly divided, clearly linear, not maintaining the character of the old. Yeah? So this is where I leave you with. I hope that you look at every campus and you look at every project with an eye that tells you that it is possible for you to do it differently, so that afterwards what happens in the use, the users will control. But you can do a difference in the design. And you should. You should think who you are designing for, and what you're designing for, and what you're planning for. Thank you.
So once again, we've been challenged by a great depth of experience and life, and thank you very much for the time and the humor and the insight that you've given us. So if I may just paraphrase a couple of things and bring it back to us here, and where this awareness and concern clearly is being expressed and understood in the context of big pictures, it actually first starts with us and an awareness of ourselves. So I think the primary lesson of learning here is understanding who we are, and in that sense who all of you are, where you're at, the choices that you're making, and the understanding that you're having of yourself. So that's the first level of understanding to reach, and that's what, through the process of being here and through negotiating with each other, that's an awareness that you're building. And then in the context of learning about design and about architecture or whatever discipline you're part of, that's the beginnings of choice making and of adding value as designers and choice makers. So the eventual commitment to the public realm and to making a difference begins here now. And thank you once again for making that connection and obviously challenging all of us with a view to what's out there in the world. But that's there, but we're also here and now. And I think if there's an opportunity for anyone who wants to comment, to remark, to share, you'd be very happy to talk. At the beginning there was an idea of creating a little bit of exchange. Perhaps now people have understood a little bit about the kind of dialogue. Would anyone like to say anything that relates to experiences they've had themselves of the world around them, or a vision for something better and different that comes from this little experience? So as we've had the experience of these talks, there's a lot to take on board, so there's no pressure in that sense of okay. Okay, well then let's get out the latte and and start beating. But okay, well let's engage in that sense. Hello.
Hello. So, ma'am, I have a question that the remedial planning which you proposed about intermixed houses of different sizes, right? So I think that is a revolutionary idea in itself, but I think it addresses only the class-based segregation. And how would it like integrate cultural, religion-based, caste-based?
Hi, thanks so much for with us. I just one of the things that really brought to mind was when I think about segregation of spaces, I think especially of the local trades in Bombay, right, where there's like a different departments, general department and the women's department. But what I'm really wondering about is that the segregation itself allows a lot of women freedom to move into the public realm, right? Like, you wouldn't be allowed to work if you had to travel with general department, for instance. So
Anything else? Or I can start and then you can add on later, yeah? So to address the first one, I do think that planning is not going to change society, right? And that the TIS example shows us that you can think in terms of your building, you can think differently. But when actually people start using it, they might use it very differently. So you do not see the kind of mixing that is seen in the architecture, you do not see in the populations. And that is a concern. So it's not as if just by changing the planning, things will shift. But changing planning forces me to think differently. So when I go to, for example, to TIS campus and I see the staff housing, and that's a non-teaching staff housing, next to the student housing, I see a lot of interaction that happens, which is along class lines, caste lines, and where the non-teaching staff is really upset with the way students behave. And it's around students' behavior with each other, how they sit over there, how they talk to each other, what they do with each other, if they smoke, drink, whatever. That becomes a moral concern for these people. That moral concern stems also from the class division that exists on campus. That students, how much do students actually engage with the non-teaching staff? As human beings, as people who are responsible for these campuses to run. As much as these campuses are made up of students and faculty, they are made up of all these people's labor. And how much does that interaction happen? Is there any interaction on any campus between these three communities? Right? So the other thing that I keep looking at this campus and seeing is that the communal spaces are continuously taken away. Where there's a space crunch, every time there's a space crunch that where people can stand and talk together, that is the space that goes. So there are things that the users will have to consciously, continuously do. There's no way that we will have a solution from here. But since class, caste, religion, they all come together. Right? They all come together in different ways. Many a times, class boundaries also mean caste boundaries. Maybe not religion, but they do mean caste boundaries many times. And so, at least some opportunity of crossing that is useful. Yeah? As far as your question goes, that's why I said that there's no clear answer whether we can do away with segregation. And that's why I insist that at least as a first step, can we talk of campuses? Can we talk of workspaces? Can we talk of spaces that are public, but not really public? This is my home for the time that I'm here. This is a space that I inhabit. Even if I'm not living there, if I work in a space, I spend most of my awake hours in that space. Right? So it is not absolutely public, it is not absolutely private. It is a semi-public kind of space. Can those spaces at least start talking in terms of removing segregations? I totally get it. I don't think that I can even imagine a Bombay local train service without the women's compartment. I would not be able to use it. Right? So I do understand that. And that's why one is not saying do away. Do away with segregation at this point. But if we continuously insist on segregation as the only way of protection in every space that we live in, then we are actually removing the chance of ever being in a space where we can have public transport that does not need to be segregated. And public transport and segregation is a long history in race, long history in gender in different ways. So actually when the Bombay Best buses, they gave seats for women, many of us were very unhappy. Because though there were, it's not as if there was no sexual harassment on the buses. But it was very, very different from the Delhi buses. You could still fight back, you could still shout, you could get support from others. It was possible. It wasn't as if you could not travel in buses. But the minute that the seats come, then the expectation for you to be on those seats is so high. So if those seats are empty and other seats are empty and you sit in the other seats, everybody is expecting you to go to those seats. So affirmation also means that. And you can see the parallels when you think of reservation and caste reservations on campuses. That the people who come through merit are also being told you go into that seat. right? So you are actually reducing my percentage to only those 6 seats. You're saying that only these 6 or 8 women should come into this bus. Actually, if you go into today into best buses, I think that's the space where you have maximum women. Meaning the percentage of women is really high in buses, because trains, finally with one compartment, how much can you pack in? Right? So I get your point of segregation, and so I would not even say that I can talk today in terms of every public loo being gender segregated, not being, or gender neutral. I would like it to become, but I'm not sure if that would work. But I do think that in spaces like this, if there are loos, I think this campus has very few loos, but that's a different question, that they ought not to be. And the other point about the trains is that what we've realized over the years is that the women's spaces are very, very hostile to gender transgressive people. Both the hijras and the transmasculine people. And I have many friends who, the hijras travel on the trains, but they rarely sit on the seats, like most other poorer women also. If you're a cis woman and you are poor, you might still try to sit on the seat and nobody will have the gumption to tell you to get up. But the hijra doesn't even try to sit on the seat. She does not travel in the men's compartment for obvious reasons, but she is not safe on the women's compartment. And neither are transmasculine men. So I know that I'm part of a queer collective, and one of the first letters that we shot out was about way back in 95. A member of ours got into a train. She was this young person around 17, 18. She used to be dressed in short hair, shirt, pant. She got in. Obviously, when they started saying, "Ladka, ladka, get out, get out, get out," and she started protesting that, "No, I am not." It wasn't as if they don't know. So the attack happens because many times men get in, and women are very sympathetic and let them be. But because this woman was actually pushed out of the train. She fell off the train. Right? So there is a hostility to transgression which happens in women's spaces also. So while I might still advocate for the gender segregated women's spaces, I would insist on them becoming gender sensitive in various ways. At least, if they have suffered and have asked for special space, they should at least be understanding of others who are marginalized by similar things. Any reflections on your hostels, on your campuses, on other campuses that you've been in? So actually the point that you raise of, when we had conversations in law school with the students, one of the things that they said, and this is the only campus which had a women's group, and this is something again that is making me think many times about campuses, because these campuses have the Ambedkar Student Association or the Ambedkar Phule Periyar Association, they have the Queer Collective, they have the Progressive Students Forum, which is kind of left-leaning or far left-leaning groups, but none of them have women's groups. And I wonder if, women have all finished with their problems and don't need to ally, or there's something else that's happening. But in this campus in law school, they had recently formed this group, which has a lovely name, which was an association of oversensitive women, right? Because every time jokes were made on their cost, they would react and they were told, oh, it's just a joke, don't be oversensitive. So they said, we are oversensitive and we are an association of oversensitive women and we are fighting that you should not be doing this kind of, this language is not acceptable to us and this behavior is not acceptable to us. But when we spoke to the queer collective, we spoke to these women, we spoke to the Ambedkar Association, all of them said that the men's hostel spaces, and especially the mess, is a space of extreme toxic masculinity. And that masculinity is not taken outside of that space. So actually that's another reason for me why you should not have only such spaces. Because there they are also castes, they are also everything. They attack men who don't behave like men in their opinion. They speak all kinds of things about women in that space. So that space is really the most toxic space as far as masculinities go. And strangely, those same very men, when they come out of that space, they do not show it with the same ease as they show it over there. So one of the reasons that we are arguing is that actually segregating is creating greater rigidities around masculinities and femininities. And so yes, it's part of our education. Part of our education to teach how to deal with violence. Violence is there. Just by us thinking that, oh, men will all be fine with each other, they are not fine with each other. Just thinking that all women will be fine with each other, they're not fine with each other. There are different ways in which discriminations are happening in these spaces. So they have to be talked about. And we have to learn how to deal with it. And that I was telling in the morning that these days I keep staying with this thought in my head, which is again from Dr. Ambedkar, that we have to be schooled into democracy. We have to learn how to be democratic. We have to learn how to be equal. This is not something that comes automatically to anybody, especially not in a society like this, where inequality is the grain of society. All of us grow up in this. So we have to learn. We have to make an effort to learn how to do a democratic process and how to talk across differences. In today's times, I think it's most important. Right? Where any difference is being attacked most violently. In that situation, it is important that we as educationists take back the space to talk across difference and to learn how to live consensually, but not with saying that everything is all right. Everything is not all right. Yeah, so all behavior is not condoned. It's not your individual choice to behave in whatever way you want. That is not democracy. How are we going to work across structural margins, structurally created differences? Right? I am privileged by my class. I am privileged by my caste. And how am I going to be aware of it when I interact with somebody else? That is something that I have to learn. And I keep learning. That's not something that will happen like this. But we have to encourage that learning rather than just put rules. What we tend to do is that, and here the we that I see as teachers, what we do is, okay, we are your proto-parents over here. So we shall do what your parents did back home. We shall discipline you. We shall tell you to behave yourselves. We shall survive you for 2 years and send you back. I don't think that that's the role of the teacher in the higher education institution. It is not even, the other role that I see is of absolute indifference. They are adults, they'll deal with their lives. Right? If they can deal with their lives, very good, excellent. But can I create spaces so that they know that some of these differences, some of these issues, some of these questions that are bothering because of the way the world is, because of the way their life is, that are affecting them, they can find a space to talk about it to somebody who is not part of that conflict. So what is happening in my hostel? Can I come and talk to somebody who will not then judge the other person? I mean, a lot of time we don't do peer conflict talking to other people. I mean, we would look down upon it. I would when I was a student. But I do see the need for a space where I can take that conflict and be sure that it will be judged and talked about and mediated in a way that is respectful of everybody. That is not saying that you are wrong, you are right, and so. So there are ways in which it can be done. People try, but people try it individually. What we need are institutional mechanisms. That's what we are hearing when we're talking to people. Sure.
So with respect to that space, it is not only the opportunity to engage and create a dialogue, but in the context of where we are, it becomes also a physical opportunity. So I think there's two levels that we may look at. And so it's an awareness of the need to communicate, the need to understand, and also then action taking. So what are we except choice makers and precipitating actions that precipitate or respond to the need for change? So I think we may take it at a number of levels, that that awareness, first of all, but your other responsibility as designers, whether it's architects or furniture or interiors or whatever medium you're working with, how also can you engage to help that process of engagement, of creating a better opportunity? So I think there's a double challenge there of fundamental awareness and then choice making and decision making. So I think that's a challenge for them, if I may. And there's obviously the possibility of much more to say. You're here, I hope, to carry on the conversation, and maybe cups of chai or in the usual manner, clustering and ourselves talking. And maybe if we've been charged, could I take the opportunity to thank you, and on your behalf to really, we really appreciate being charged and being challenged in this very positive way. So thank you very much indeed.